I was afraid that this would be a bit of a survivor's party. I see it's not. Welcome back. Very good to see you. We have a team here. We have Julie Wilhelmsen and her leg. We have Jeff Mankoff from the Defense University. We have Morten Hogland from the Ministry of the Ministry of International Affairs, and we have Luigi Carbone from the LUIS Mediterranean platform in Rome. And the topic that we are supposed to tackle will be Make Russia Great Again, as it were. I was at a panel at the International Studies Association 3 years ago, which was called Make X Great Again, and we had 7 papers on 7 different countries that wanted to be great again. So this time it's Russia. Julie, you're up.
Okay, so my first observation would be that Putin's project has always been to make Russia great again. But there are different versions of it. And I think it's worthwhile going back. When Putin first came to power, he said we need to have a power vertical in Russia. Making Russia great again was, in a way, a domestic project. It was also about taking Chechnya back into the Russian Federation, control of Chechnya. And it was, we should not forget, improving Russia's economy by integrating Russia with the West. And then we actually had a new layer of that in the early 2000s when Russia became a so-called strategic partner with the West after the 9/11 events. And Russia's war on Chechnya was, of course, framed as a war on terror. So it's a long story how that partnership unraveled. But the point of remembering this is simply to say that the project of making Russia great again has changed, and Russia's relations to different other great powers, which was also in the topic of our panel, has shifted. So if we fast forward to Russia today, I think many of us, including myself, we were taken aback by the 2022 re-invasion, which we call it now, because it seemed to signal a Make Russia Great Again project, which I at least hadn't been aware of enough. It seemed to signal a kind of imperial, blindly expanding type project on the Kremlin's side, and not a very well calculated undertaking, so to say. But then there's also been the Make Russia Great Again project, which has a much longer line if you go back in the discourse of the Kremlin, and that is Russia as the revanchist power. And what Ivor, in a way, mentioned, the enormous focus on being against whatever Russia does, whatever the West does, picking up pace with the discourse on the color revolutions, NATO expansion, etc. So I would say that is the type of identity discourse which has returned also now in the war on Ukraine. So the imperial discourse is actually not as strong any longer. It's more still about this claim that the West is trying to get to Russia now through Ukraine. And I think even though we have to note that Russian propaganda, which a lot of the Kremlin talk is about, is very, very eclectic. So they work with these different versions of what they are and what they're wanting to do, and they do it, I think, very consciously, because it means that you can play up a version of what Russia is doing when you need it. So, for example, they have found out that the discourse on saving the Russophone population in the eastern Ukraine actually works pretty well with the Russian domestic public. Therefore, that's something which is still lifted up in Kremlin discourse. So that's just to say that it's quite difficult to say today what is the Great Again project of Putin actually about. And when Karen and I have been doing these readings, we do readings of lots of Russian texts. I would say as one core project now to keep your eyes on, or one core articulation, which this is not only our finding, you find it in now books by established Russian scholars, it is the notion of a state civilization. Mm-hmm. So I think if you want to understand how Russia wants to become great again, you should follow how they articulate this state civilization. So just a few comments on what that seems to imply. So a state civilization is obviously something more than a national state. And according to Putin, the borders of the state civilization is in a way defined by the people who belong to this civilization. And if you look at how they draw up the picture of this civilization, it's an organic yet still authentic quality to the civilization. So it's about a particular civilization's values, traditional values, also its way of doing politics, so political system, and its particular historical experience. So for our work, we're trying to, find out, is there a difference with Russia's project in the far and near abroad? This actually kind of explains why there is a difference. Because the Ukrainians, of course, are just squarely put into this state civilization. They are on the inside of the borders. Whereas in Syria, Russia portrays itself much more as an external actor. So I don't know if there were any other important points, but at least
I think that's fine.
That's fine. but the last thing I wanted to say is that we're all watching how great does Russia want to be. Mm-hmm. That yes, it means that the project is outside of Russia's borders, obviously, but it's not limitless. Because these civilizations in Russian discourse, they are kind of indigenous and they cannot be influenced or changed, or should not. So in a way, here comes the protection which you have to keep these civilizations.
Thank you so much. Jeff?
Okay, thank you. I have to start by, first of all, thanking NUPI for organizing this, but also add the disclaimer that because I work for National Defense University in Washington, my views are my own and don't reflect those of my employer or the US government. Okay, with that out of the way. I think it's worth keeping in mind that this idea of making Russia great again, if you want to put it in those terms, has existed in some form almost from the beginning of the modern Russian Federation, because for the Russian elite, the Russian leadership, the collapse of the Soviet Union represented a loss. It was a loss of an identity, it was a loss of status, it was a loss of territory, it was a loss of a kind of ontological understanding of who we were. And so a lot of Russian politics and foreign policy as a subset of Russian politics has been organized since 1991 on this again, on this making Russia great again, this recognition that Russia had lost something and that its natural status was greater than the real existing Russia of the post-Soviet era. In his so-called Millennium Message in 1999, when he'd been designated Boris Yeltsin's successor, Vladimir Putin gave a speech sort of articulating his worldview and what he saw the role of his approaching presidency to be. And he said in that speech, Russia is and always has been a great country, but it risks falling into the second, third, or even fourth rank of powers if we don't do something about it. And so this was in 1999. And so if you think about the whole quarter century of Putin's time in power, making sure that Russia didn't fall into this second, third, fourth rank of powers has been one of the organizing principles, one of the priorities of his entire presidency. Now, what does it mean to be great? There were surveys done of Russian citizens, lots of surveys have been done. And even if you look at surveys done in the 1990s, you get a large percentage, sometimes a plurality, of Russian citizens saying Russia should be a great power. But then you start drilling down on what that actually means. And especially in a lot of these earlier surveys, when people were asked what they meant by Russia should be a great power, they said a prosperous country with a good economy and a good standard of living. And for a lot of people, I think that was the dominant understanding of this concept, at least in the early post-Soviet era. And in fact, I would argue the first of Putin's two sort of long terms in the Kremlin, so from 2000 to 2008, rested on a sort of implicit social contract. And part of that social contract was improving people's standard of living. It was creating stability, it was growing the economy, it was helping recover some of the lost status that individuals as individuals had suffered with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, when Putin comes back after the 4-year Medvedev interlude, when he comes back in 2011, 2012, there's a sort of different understanding of what that social compact looks like. And it becomes much more centered around Russia as a great power on the international stage. And I think there are a variety of reasons for why this shift took place. Julie mentioned the color revolutions. I think that's a big one. In one of the earlier panels today, there's some touching on the Arab Spring. I think that's also a big driver because the Russian leadership, Putin, looked at the color revolutions, looked at the Arab Spring as being sort of similar phenomena. These were driven by, in his understanding, Western democracy promotion, Western NGOs, George Soros, right? And Russia was on the list in the self-understanding of the elite for countries that were facing this same sort of Western onslaught. And if you remember back to this period when Putin is planning his return to the Kremlin in 2011, 2012, there are these massive protests against the decision to, as they called it in Russian, rokirovka, castling, like in chess, between Putin and Medvedev. So it's not super far-fetched, this understanding of Russia as being sort of next in line for a color revolution. And then once Putin is back, sort of organizing his second term in the Kremlin from 2012 on around some of these anti-Western, pushing back against the West, restoring Russia as a major actor on the world stage. That's been the dominant theme. And that informs, I think, the first annexation, the first intervention in Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, to some degree the intervention in Syria, and then certainly, and we've seen this turbocharged with the second invasion of Ukraine in 2022. I've got some other thoughts on sort of concepts of empire and civilization and all of that, but I think we'll save that for the discussion.
Thanks.
If you want to jump here, since I'm the odd man out, you can do that. If you want
Gentlemen.
to try it.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so I'll pick up on the issue of Russia revanchism that Julie has mentioned and look at how this has played out in the Middle East and North Africa, because that's the region outside, near abroad, where Russia has tried to have a comeback. And it's a region that obviously plays an important role, as since '91 in the Russian post-Soviet times, Russia has lost a lot of its influence and capacity to play a role in this region. Indeed, a few remaining allies like Algeria and Syria were there, but Russia's role was clearly diminished. So this idea of making Russia great again comes back also trying to revamp the projection in the MENA region. And Arab Spring was an opportunity to start playing into the geopolitical dynamics that came about and the several civil wars. But obviously, as everybody knows, the key moment has been Russian military intervention in Syria in 2015. That is very much a hard power projection. That is very much a successful operation because it managed to change the balance of forces against that were going against Assad regime. And above all, it's an operation that has an important return in image for Russia in the region. I mean, after all, projection of power and strength resonates strongly amongst many of the countries in the region. And in fact, we see in this period, 2015, 2021, 22, a sort of increased capacity of Russia to project itself with a number of countries, and not the traditional ones. Actually, Algeria is an interesting example because you would expect the doubling down, a deepening of the relationship, but not much happens in these times. So there is a lot of posturing, but neither one of the two sides seems to be able to invest deeply. Also because, as has been said also this morning, Russia has not much to offer. I mean, in economic terms, it's not a big player. If anything, trade picks up in this period, 2015 to 2021, a little bit on arms sales, but and the rest are commodities, which Russia exports. If you look at bilateral trade balances, not much is moving with no country in the region. And so it has to do more on diplomatic projection, the idea that Russia can become a partner that helps countries in the region in geopolitical posturing. Lots has been said about the rise of regional powers and how Russia plays the card there, not only in civil wars, but more in general in Africa, as we've seen. I would take the Russian invasion of Ukraine as a turning point, because that, at the time, there was a lot of preoccupation, particularly in the West, whether this Russia would be able to use the Middle East and North Africa and its new relationship in MENA as a way to disrupt even further the West and try to play it as a card in the Ukraine war. Not much has happened in reality, and I would say, and probably the opposite is true. If you look at, for instance, there is an interesting survey by Arab Barometer in 2024, and if you look, I mean, Russia still plays figures relatively high in public perception amongst the public opinions in the Arab countries. And nevertheless, there is no much movement in the post-22 context. The Russia image remains more or less similar, with the slight increase in Morocco and Tunisia, but it's an interesting decrease in the Levant. So that may have to do with the fact that, and we come to the issue that has been mentioned today, which I think is very important, walk the talk. I mean, all the Russian imaging and narratives over protecting global South interest against Western imperialists that basically have not materialized at all in the context of the Middle Eastern wars. After October 7, the Gaza war, there has been some rhetoric, but not much action at all. Even in the case of Iran, the relationship with Iran has not, apart from some exchange in weapons, has not materialized at all in any concrete support when Iran was attacked by Israel and the US. All that as an impact in the image of Russia in the region. I think the image of power and strength has been tarnished. I think that Russia is being on a retreating trend. I mean, this is being clearly witnessed in the debacle in Syria. But I would say even in the lack of capacity to concretize its dream of establishing a base in the Red Sea, it's after long negotiations with Sudan, they finally decided to definitely freeze for the time being the idea of a base, a naval base in Port Sudan. It is projecting, and it's even the capacity to play a role in the post-conflict scene is nowhere to be seen. Russia doesn't have a place at the table in the post-ceasefire arrangement. It's all US dominated, and if it's clearly it doesn't project an image of a strong geopolitical actor capable of shaping the source of the Middle East. All that has an impact, I think, in Russia image, and we will probably have to see what happens if and when the Russian war in Ukraine ends, and whether the Russia may be able to play a comeback in the region. I would say, though, that it's for the time being, Russia is more a taker than a maker of great powers dynamics, and that applies to the MENA region and beyond that.
Thank you, dear colleague.
Okay. I will be focusing on the Arctic, Russia in the Arctic, but I'm not a Russian expert, and I'm a practitioner. I had the privilege of sharing on the diplomatic level Norwegian chairship of the Arctic Council from May 23 to May this year. Before Norway took over as chair of the Arctic Council, it was Russia that was chairing the council. And Russia had a very ambitious, of course, program. Arctic Council, 8 Arctic states, Russia, roughly half of the territory. So, of course, a very strong Arctic state. There's a big interest in the region. It's for Norway as well. It's our home region. We have core interest, long-term interest. Then, as has been referenced so many times today, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in late February 22, in the middle of the Russian chairmanship. So there was discussion among the 7 other states what to do. Other regional arrangements in Europe, in the north, but also elsewhere, in a way failed in the sense that they either suspended Russia or they kind of broke apart. Our intention was, together with all our like-minded states, that should not happen in this case. We have to find a way to keep everybody together. We are here not because we have the same opinion on every issue under the sun, but because we share geography, we share some kind of responsibility in a part of the world. For Norway, having stability, predictability in the north, in the Arctic, has always been a core interest. My sense, our sense, is that that's the same for the others as well. They see the Arctic Council is definitely not the only answer to that kind of predictability. UNCLOS and other mechanisms plays a huge part. But the Arctic Council plays one part of this puzzle. And the Arctic Council falling apart, ceasing to exist, it was a child of the Cold War, end of the Cold War. It has a strong focus on indigenous participation, representation. It has a long list of observers, including some of the most populous countries in the world. There are certain global interests, not trying to elevate the level of the importance of but still. So finding modalities that could keep us together, even under such difficult circumstances, and we must, at this time, it was the Biden administration, it was Jack Sullivan who was the National Security Council, and Victoria Nuland was in state. So just finding a way to get an acceptance in all capitals for how do we deal with Russia in this, that was the big puzzle. And we were preparing to be chair, so we felt that the responsibility was very much on us in a way to lead the process, and I was given the responsibility to discuss also with Moscow how do we navigate from Russia to Norway, and how do we make the best out of this situation. In this sense, I could rely on that Russia would be, in a way, predictable. Commitments made previously in the Arctic Council context would be upheld, and they had their long-term interest, I felt was in a way sincere. But of course, with any country, and especially, I believe, any big country, there will be different players within a country with different opinions. So for us, it was also important to try to show that we were serious, that when we say that we wanted the Arctic Council to be relevant for all 8 Arctic countries, we meant it. And we, in the sense, not only in kind of speaking up, because in media it was portrayed as the 7 other countries, we are just moving ahead and we will leave Russia on the sidelines. So it was a lot of my job to tell Russia that that was not the case, to tell the media that was not the case, but not only talk, you talk about walk the talk, but in practice put in place activities and mechanism that actually proved that that was not the case. So that was where I'm coming from. I'm happy to go further into this, but and I also just want to add, since China has been put up in some questions, where does China fit into this? In October 22, just about half a year before we were going on a share, China made a statement saying that if Norway do not incorporate Russia properly within the Arctic Council, we will not longer support the Arctic Council. So that was just kind of a remark on the sidelines, but just to, so it was, and it didn't put any added pressure because the pressure was already there, but it was just at least a comment for a state who followed us with interest. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have a quick question for each of you. If you can be equally quick, we can then open it to the audience. And Julie, civilization started as a singular. It was a French concept from the 1700s, and the idea was that civilization equaled French civilization, basically. Then there was a change where it meant a plurality. Edmund Burke, at the end of the 1700s, said that Europe was a civilization in the sense that you could be in any one part of it and feel at home. And this was formalized by people like Morse and Durkheim, who said that a civilization would be sort of consisting of different bits that would make a whole. Now the question then becomes, if Russia should be a state civilization, it seems to me that there will be a Russian core, and then there will be trimmings. Indigenous peoples, Ukrainians, Serbs, etc. What kind of civilizational idea is this?
No, I think, again, it's reading different texts. This is not a concept which appears in the same shape when you find it in different texts, right? It's very, and as I said, that's a strategic tool for the Kremlin, to be able to move its concepts around so that it fits certain situation, external policies, internal policies. So definitely, and here there's also going to be a big difference between what is said and what is done. But we do know, we have certain kind of clear points, which is that the Russian language is given a special status within this civilization. And I just participated in a workshop on the Northern Caucasus, where there is great worry because the policies where the indigenous languages have had, a proper place in school, for example, that policy is now shifting. So that would be more on the practical level, and I think one would have to investigate, how it's put into practice.
So the way you present it sounds like the idea of state civilization is Russian nationalism writ large.
Well, this is. I think we would have to. It would look different in different when it appears as a concept in different texts. So in the text which Philip and I have been reading, I noted one thing, and it's the notion that yes, in the state civilization there would be diversity, but more importantly, it would be stability, and there would be harmony.
Oh, really?
So it's and that's kind of an echo of a theme in Putin's discourse over more than 20 years. It's the notion of unity, right? So it's okay. We will have, Russia has official religions and constantly says, Russia compared to the US, Russia knows Islam. It knows it has Islam, it caters to Islam, it can house Islam. But at the same time, so there's a contradiction there. And of course, the more of this power vertical, which is put into place under Putin and which has accelerated enormously since 2022, because the invasion was, I think, perceived by himself first, not as a popular project, right? So that means that the efforts to control become stronger and stronger, and we see that in the practices of the Russian state. So the unity theme in this loose concept, of course, becomes much more dominant.
Jeff, you said that you had some additional ideas on empire. How do those play up against what Julie is saying here?
Sure. So these concepts, state, empire, civilization, in the Russian discourse, they tend to overlap a little bit. But of course, in the post-Cold War rules-based international order, as we were calling it for a while, states are defined by fixed borders. There is a very clear limit, very clear outer limit to where a state is located. But some of these other concepts that have become popular in the Russian discourse over the last several years don't respect fixed borders. And something like civilization is much murkier because it can be used to appropriate for Russian civilization territories that are physically beyond the borders of the Russian Federation. And you've seen that used in different ways vis-a-vis Ukraine and Belarus on the one hand, which are portrayed in a lot of the Russian discourse now as not foreign in any meaningful way. And then places like the South Caucasus and Central Asia on the other, which are portrayed as being tied to Russian civilization and therefore part of this larger trans-state entity, but are not, Russian in quite the same way that this discourse posits Ukraine and Belarus as being. And there are two other terms that I want to just emphasize really quickly. One, so you hear this discussion of Russia as a state civilization, but at the same time, and this is a term that's in official usage as well, Russia is described as a civilization of civilizations. And I think that gets to this question of diversity and unity, right? So, the ethnic Russian, Ruski, Orthodox civilization is one piece of this larger, or is portrayed as being one piece of this larger collectivity of multiple civilizations that fall under the aegis of this Russian imperial project. And that provides some space for diversity, whether that's expressed in religious terms or linguistic terms or however you want to define it. But at the same time, Julie's right, we've seen this consolidation, centralization of the actual practices in terms of how Moscow rules over, not only the occupied parts of Ukraine, but some of the peripheral parts of the Russian Federation itself. And so the second term that I think it's important to understand is one that's been used by Russian ethnic nationalists for a long time, but never had official sanction until a couple of years ago. And that is the notion of the ethnic Russians as the state-forming people, государство образующие, which is kind of a mouthful. But this has actually been entered into legislation now, and I think even in the Constitution. It refers to the multi-ethnic Russian people bound together by the state-forming ethnic Russian people. And so that provides a basis or a platform for making the ethnic Russian way of doing things, including the language and potentially the orthodoxy, as being kind of privileged within this multi-layer civilization of civilizations. So there's this balance that I think the Kremlin is trying to strike between, on the one hand, acknowledging the reality of diversity and trying to make a virtue of this diversity, because Russia's not just a nation state. It is a, as they portray it, civilization of civilizations, but at the same time trying to emphasize this theme of unity against the threat of disintegration, which has always been an overriding fear, and certainly, the collapse of the Soviet Union along ethnic lines showed the very reality of that kind of fear.
Thank you. Professor, the point was made by your colleague that American extravaganzas in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya had been noted throughout the region, and that this had given the US a bad rap, and that it had opened the field for talking about Russia as a non-imperial power. But one wonders, there's something very strange here, given how Russia actually behaved in Syria from 2015 onwards. If it's the case that Russia is not marked as an imperial power after that little excursion, what would be the explanation of that?
I think it's an interesting question. I think it has to do with the fact that Russia narratives intersect existing sentiments, as Virginie has been saying in her presentation. The anti-Western, anti-colonization narrative is very strongly felt. I would say it's even on the rise. It's quite impressive how much it shapes, for instance, political views in Africa. It's even more than in the Middle East. The strategic opportunism, the flexibility that Russia has shown in intersecting local sentiments and making using them to plug in with its own narratives is probably the explanation. I agree with what you have been discussing. This concept of civilization, of civilizations of civilizations, it doesn't really make sense, and it doesn't provide for a real alternative to the liberal order, the Western-led order, the way they depict it. It's unclear how and why it should produce a better world. And it's interesting that even in the foreign policy documents that have to do with these ideological projects, there is not much said. And some of the regions that don't have civilization traditionally appear there as left in a limbo, like Africa, which would just be a regional order without any major civilizational construct. So I would say the fact that Russia has not been singled out as an imperial power has to do with the capacity of Russia to play with existing sentiments that are stronger. I mean, obviously we have to come to terms with the fact that the West and the Western-led models are basically in retreating and broadly seen in much of the world, in the global south or whatever other designation you want to use for the rest of the world, as responsible for all the evils that we are witnessing at the moment. And it's an easy game if you try to maximize your image, and you don't have to, and you will not be called accountable for whatever you have been doing because it doesn't appear to be there. I think it's a short-term game. I mean, they will not be able to sustain it for much longer, especially if they get entangled into great power dynamics, because then the game becomes much less ideological and much more hard power.
Can I add?
We don't have the time, I'm afraid. It's interesting because if you look at the period of formal imperialism in a country like Uganda, the time is soon at hand when that period is equally long when the period has elapsed since that time. So it's interesting if there should become an upsurge in the talk about that. And finally, confidence-building measures. And at a place like the OSCE, one is now going back to scratch and talking about trying to build confidence-building measures with Russia, very much in the spirit of the early 70s, as it were. Are we back there, and what could those measures be?
Well, I will be very careful to go outside my scope of responsibility, but I will direct your question into what I know something about. So, what we saw where we could build with Russia then in particular, but it goes during a very challenging time when the working methods for sure were not the same as it was. First we had COVID, and then we had this situation after the full-scale invasion, building on personalities who established networks, established interest, established core, when you have a la carte organization like the Arctic Council where you work on so many things, but there are certain elements or certain where you have the amazing researchers from this country or that country, and Russia certainly has a number of them, and you plug into that, you build on that, and through recognizing such just value of input coming from that institution or specifically from one person, you build confidence. You don't throw everything out. You go back, and it helps in we are mostly famous for work on environmental issues, but work on a lot of else things, on search and rescue and energy and so on. But let's say on the environmental, which is, and we don't work on military security, makes it a lot easier. So it was, easy to, in a way, pinpoint certain areas where Russia was doing distinguished work and put them in the lead. Even during the most difficult times, we did workshops out in the field, not in Russia, elsewhere, with Russians leading, because they were recognized for their quality of work. But that could not have been possible unless we had a history to build on. So you have to look what is the possibilities, and we put up a wildland fire initiative, because wildland fires in the Arctic and globally has become a very hot topic,
so to speak.
Truly, Siberia, Canada, and so on. So it was, and Russia had a lot of specific interest. We didn't get as deep within Russia on that issue as we wanted to, but it was certainly recognized as an issue of great interest and value, because it's very practical, very concrete, and you look at different aspects to merge emergency preparedness, response, how to make sure local communities can, be the first responders and so on. So trying to identify areas. So that was our approach.
Thank you. We have time for one question. Professor Ver, Derek, I noticed that you couldn't ask your question the last time. Would you like to ask it now?
I've got 3 completely different questions now, so I don't... Not questions, actually.
What about
comments.
settling for one?
Okay, I'll restrict it, if we only got 2 minutes, to the last thing that Eva raised, the issue of Russia as an imperial power. I honestly, and we referred back to the Syria intervention, honestly, I cannot say how this was the work of an imperial power. There was no question of hegemony. It was seeking, admittedly, to maintain, not to create, but to maintain a client state, because that is historical relations with Hafiz al-Assad and then with Bashar al-Assad. Relatively little in the way of boots on the ground. In other words, a very limited intervention. And really, Russia never had that influence over Assad. Assad was very intransigent. That became clear very early on, after the beginning of the Arab Spring, after the Syrian civil war broke out. So really, how was that Russia as an imperial power? Maybe if you're talking about the neighborhood, with the historical things. But when was Russia? Well, you've got to go back to the early 19th century, probably the first half of the 19th century, if you were talking about Russia as a real imperialist power, when they were fighting the Turks and the Persians, as we then called them, for control over trade routes, etc. But now, for me, that's something in the past. That's historical. And I honestly don't see how it's an imperial power. And I think sometimes we get clouded by certain simple or simplistic ideas, which need to be rethought if we're going to really understand what Russia's doing there. I've got 1 or 2 other kind of points which are more or less on the same area, but we haven't really time.
Thank you. Would you like to respond before we pass it on?
No, I agree. I mean, it's interesting that part of, also in terms of the narratives, of what Russia's trying to say, tries to reconnect with Soviet narratives on anti-colonial sentiments and anti-colonial policy, and that they are all attributed to the West. So it plays into the hands of the Russians to say that the West is the culprit of colonialism. We never had this in our history, except perhaps in what they did in Central Asia, on the Caucasus in the 19th century. But that's, as you say, it's historical rather than contemporary.
Before we hand it over to Jakub Kulczywiecki for a final word, I think we should give our panelists a round of applause.
First of all, I would like to thank you all for coming and being with us until the very end. We know that the last panel is always sort of a challenge after being served some food for thought, after being served some food for lunch. It's always quite of a challenge for purely biological reasons. But I would like to use this opportunity to thank my colleagues from the RUSMENA team for making those important contributions. We are looking very much forward to having something to be presented to a broader audience once we are done with all those articles that we are in the process of writing. Otherwise, I would also like to express my gratitude to the Norwegian audience. We have a room with a place to 150 people, and I see that there are not so many empty places for the time being, which is very encouraging, because it seems that what we have been doing over the past years is something that is attracting some public attention, which is good, because it means that the Norwegian taxpayers' money is being spent in a kind of wise and relevant relevant manner. And then commenting on the last round of discussions, we also would like to make it clear that we expect that Russian conferences organized by NUPI are going to go ahead for many years to come, because we have seen that Russia has not turned into a kind of normal power. There are so many challenges to be revealed and discussed concerning Russia's position in the international system. One term that was not mentioned neither in the first nor in the second, and even not so much in the last panel, is the issue of the Russian exceptionalism. This is something that has been used quite often to describe Russian approaches to the international system, and this issue of exceptionalism is most probably something that is going to put its mark on the debate on Russia as an international actor in many years to come. So I expect that we will have a very interesting discussion at the Russia Conference 2026, Russian Conference 2027, 28, 29, and even maybe 2030. So please feel free to come back to join us for the next rounds of discussions about Russia's exceptionalism, how this plays out in the context, in the regional context, in the global context. MENA region is definitely an interesting prism to look at Russia, but I unfortunately expect that there are going to be other prisms to be looked to at Russia as an international actor. So please join us in 2026, 2027, 2028, and 2029, and maybe even in 2030. See you again.